The wind howled across the empty plains like a wounded animal, carrying with it the scent of dust and distant storms. Samuel Hartwell stood at his kitchen window, watching the sun bleed crimson across the horizon, painting the endless grassland in shades of fire and shadow. At 52, his weathered hands bore the calluses of 3 decades, working this unforgiving land, and his gray eyes held the weight of too many lonely nights and silent mornings. The Double H Ranch stretched for miles in every direction, a testament to the dreams he and his late wife Martha had shared. But dreams, Samuel had learned, were fragile things that could shatter as easily as morning frost under the harsh Texas sun. Martha had been gone 8 years now, taken by the fever that swept through the territory like God's own judgment, leaving Samuel alone with nothing but memories and the endless cycle of cattle, fences, and solitude. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot that had been brewing since dawn, the bitter liquid providing little comfort against the ache that had settled permanently in his chest. The house felt cavernous around him, built for a family that never came, with empty rooms that echoed his footsteps like accusatory whispers. He'd built this place with his own hands, every board and nail chosen with care, every room planned with hope for children's laughter and Martha's gentle singing. Now it stood as a monument to what might have been. The nearest neighbor was 20 miles east, and the town of Cedar Ridge lay 30 miles south, close enough for supplies but far enough that Samuel could go weeks without seeing another human soul. He preferred it that way. Or at least that's what he told himself during the long winter nights when the wind rattled the shutters and the silence pressed against his ears like cotton. Samuel's routine had become as predictable as the sunrise. Up before dawn to tend the cattle, mending fences, checking water sources, riding the boundaries of his land on his faithful sorrel mare Rosie. The work kept his hands busy and his mind occupied, though it couldn't fill the hollow space where his heart used to be. In the evenings, he'd sit on the front porch with his coffee and his thoughts, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast canopy above, feeling smaller and more insignificant with each passing day. This particular evening carried an unusual chill for September, and storm clouds gathered on the horizon like an army preparing for battle. Samuel had spent the day moving cattle to higher ground, knowing from years of experience that the dry creek bed behind his house could become a raging torrent within hours when the rains came. His back ached from the long hours in the saddle, and his joints creaked like old leather as he settled into his favorite chair on the porch. The first drops of rain began to fall as darkness claimed the land, fat droplets that struck the dust with tiny explosions of sound. Samuel watched the lightning dance across the sky, counting the seconds between flash and thunder, gauging the storm's approach. He'd weathered countless storms in this house, both the kind that came from the sky and the kind that came from within, and he'd learned to face them with stoic resignation. It was then, between one lightning flash and the next, that he heard it. A sound so unexpected, so out of place in his world of wind and weather, that he almost convinced himself it was his imagination, a soft knocking at his front door, barely audible above the growing storm. Samuel's hand froze halfway to his coffee cup, his entire body tensing with an alertness born of years of frontier living. Nothing good ever came calling in the middle of a storm, especially not this far from civilization. The knocking came again, more insistent this time, and Samuel slowly rose from his chair, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt revolver at his hip. He'd learned long ago that kindness could be a weakness on the frontier, and unexpected visitors often brought trouble in their wake. Indians had been quiet in this territory for years, but desperate men driven by hunger or greed still roamed the lonely spaces between towns, and Samuel had tangled with his share of cattle rustlers and drifters over the years. He approached the door with measured steps, his bare feet silent on the wooden floor. The house had grown cold with the approaching storm, and he could feel the temperature dropping with each gust of wind that rattled the windows. Through the small window beside the door, he could see nothing but darkness and the silver curtain of rain that had begun to fall in earnest. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. The response that came back made his blood run cold with its unexpectedness. "Please, Mister," came a small voice barely audible above the storm. "I need help." Samuel's hand hesitated on the door latch. The voice was young, undeniably young, and carried a tremor that might have been cold or fear or both. Against every instinct screaming at him to be cautious, he slowly opened the door, keeping his body positioned behind the solid oak frame. What he saw in the flickering light of his oil lamp defied every expectation his frontier, hardened mind had conjured. Standing on his porch, soaked to the bone and shivering like a leaf in the wind, was a young girl who couldn't have been more than 12 years old. Her long dark hair was plastered to her head, and her simple cotton dress clung to her thin frame, doing little to protect her from the storm's fury. In her small hands, she clutched a bundle of what looked like her worldly possessions, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had seen better days. But it was her eyes that struck Samuel like a physical blow. They were the deepest blue he'd ever seen, like the sky just before dawn, and they held a maturity that no child should possess. They were Martha's eyes, he realized with a start that made his heart skip a beat. Not the same color, but carrying the same gentle strength, the same quiet dignity that had first drawn him to his wife all those years ago. "Dear God," Samuel whispered, lowering his weapon and stepping back from the door. "Child, what are you doing out in this storm?" The girl swayed slightly on her feet, and Samuel realized she was at the end of her strength. Without another thought, he reached out and gently guided her inside, his large hands surprisingly gentle as they led her away from the driving rain. She was cold as ice, her lips tinged blue with the chill, and he could feel her trembling through the thin fabric of her dress. "Sit down," he commanded, guiding her to the chair closest to the fireplace. He quickly moved to stoke the dying embers into a proper fire, adding kindling and logs until the flames danced high and warm. The girl sat in silence, her small hands wrapped around the bundle in her lap, water dripping from her clothes to form puddles on the wooden floor. Samuel grabbed a thick woolen blanket from the chest beside the fireplace and draped it around her shoulders, noting how she seemed to disappear within its folds. She was thinner than she should be. He realized her cheekbones too prominent, her wrists too narrow. This was a child who had known hunger, and the knowledge settled in his stomach like a cold stone. "What's your name, child?" he asked, kneeling beside her chair so he wouldn't tower over her. Up close, he could see the exhaustion etched in every line of her young face, the way her eyes struggled to stay focused on his. "Emily," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "Emily Rose Patterson." "Patterson," Samuel repeated the name, tugging at his memory. "Are you kin to Jacob Patterson? Had a spread about 40 miles north of here." Emily nodded, and Samuel saw tears beginning to gather in those remarkable eyes. "Was my pa," she said, her voice breaking on the words. "Was." Samuel felt his heart constrict with understanding. He'd heard rumors from the last time he'd been to town, whispers about fever hitting the Patterson place, about tragedy striking another frontier family. But he'd been so wrapped up in his own isolation that he hadn't paid much attention to the gossip. Now, looking at this child's face, he wished he had. "The fever?" he asked gently, and Emily nodded again, a single tear rolling down her cheek. "Took ma first," she whispered. "Then little Tom, my brother. Pa lasted longest." But she trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. But Samuel understood. He'd seen fever work its way through families before, taking everything in its path like a prairie fire. "How long ago?" Samuel asked, his voice gentle despite the anger building in his chest. Not anger at her, but at a world that could leave a child alone in the wilderness, at neighbors who had apparently done nothing to help, at himself for not knowing, not caring enough to check on his fellow ranchers. Emily said, her voice steadying slightly. "Pa made me promise to find help, to find good people who might." She looked up at him with those eyes that reminded him so painfully of Martha. "He said there was a man named Hartwell who lived south of here. Said he was a good man who might help." Samuel felt something crack inside his chest, some wall he'd built around his heart over the long years of solitude. Jacob Patterson had been an acquaintance rather than a friend, but they'd done business together occasionally, trading cattle and sharing information about water sources and weather patterns. The fact that Jacob had sent his daughter to him, had trusted him with her life, was both an honor and a burden he wasn't sure he was ready to bear. "Your pa was a good man," Samuel said finally. "I'm right sorry for your loss, Emily." She nodded, accepting his condolences with a dignity that broke his heart. "I walked for 2 days," she said. "Got lost once, had to sleep in a cave last night. I was starting to think I'd never find your place when I saw your lights." Samuel looked at her with new respect. To walk 40 miles across hostile territory, alone and afraid, took a courage that many grown men didn't possess. This child had steel in her spine, even if her body was ready to collapse from exhaustion. "You must be hungry," he said, rising to his feet. "When's the last time you ate?" Emily's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "Yesterday morning. Found some berries by a creek." Samuel's jaw tightened with anger at the injustice of it all. While he'd been wallowing in his own self-pity, this child had been fighting for survival, walking through dangerous country with nothing but faith and determination to guide her. The shame of it burned in his throat like acid. He moved to the kitchen, his movements automatic as he began preparing food. There was stew left over from his own meager dinner, and he heated it over the fire, adding water and extra vegetables to stretch it further. He buttered thick slices of bread and poured a glass of milk from the jug he kept in the cold cellar, his hands working while his mind raced with questions and possibilities he wasn't ready to face. When he returned to the sitting room, he found Emily fast asleep in the chair, her head tilted to one side, the bundle still clutched protectively in her arms. She looked impossibly young in the firelight. Her face relaxed for the first time since she'd appeared at his door. Samuel set the food aside and studied her sleeping features, seeing glimpses of her father in the stubborn set of her jaw, but something else too, something that reminded him of dreams he'd thought long buried. He covered her more securely with the blanket and settled into the chair across from her, his own meal forgotten as he watched the storm rage outside his windows. The rain hammered against the glass like buckshot, and the wind howled with a fury that shook the entire house. No weather for man or beast to be abroad, yet this child had been out in it, alone and afraid, trusting in the kindness of a stranger she'd never met. Samuel found himself thinking about Martha, about the conversations they'd had during their brief marriage about children and family. Martha had wanted children desperately, and Samuel had shared that dream, but God had seen fit to deny them that blessing. After Martha's death, he'd convinced himself that it was for the best, that he wasn't meant to be a father, that his solitary life was what he deserved. Now, looking at Emily's peaceful face in the firelight, he wondered if perhaps God was offering him a second chance, a possibility he'd never dared to imagine. The thought terrified him more than any storm or wild animal ever could. He'd failed Martha in so many ways, hadn't been able to protect her from the fever that claimed her life. How could he possibly be responsible for another person, especially one so young and vulnerable? But even as the doubts crowded his mind, Samuel felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. This child needed him, had walked through hell to find him, and he couldn't simply turn her away come morning. The question was what to do with her, where she could go, who would take responsibility for her care. The storm raged through the night, and Samuel dozed fitfully in his chair, waking every time the thunder crashed overhead or the wind shifted the timbers of his house. Each time he woke, his eyes found Emily, still sleeping peacefully despite the chaos outside, and each time he felt that strange stirring in his chest, like frost melting under the first warm sun of spring. Dawn came gray and sullen, the storm having passed but leaving behind a world washed clean and glittering with moisture. Samuel woke to find Emily sitting up in her chair, watching him with those remarkable eyes, the bundle still in her lap like a shield against the world. "Morning," Samuel said, his voice rough with sleep and emotion. "How are you feeling?" "Better, thank you," Emily replied politely, though Samuel could see the uncertainty in her face, the question she was afraid to ask. She was old enough to understand that her arrival at his door was just the beginning of her problems, not the end. Samuel heated the stew from the night before and watched Emily eat with the focused intensity of someone who had known real hunger. She had excellent manners despite her circumstances, eating slowly and thanking him repeatedly for his kindness. It was clear that her parents had raised her well in the brief time they'd had together. "Emily," Samuel said when she'd finished eating, "we need to talk about what happens next." Her face tightened with apprehension, but she nodded bravely. "Yes, sir." Samuel struggled to find the right words, aware that whatever he said next would shape both their futures in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. "You can't stay here indefinitely," he began, then immediately regretted the harsh sound of the words. Emily's face fell, and he saw her grip tighten on her bundle. "I understand," she said quietly. "Pay said there might be folks in town who would take me in, maybe families that needed help with chores or—" "No," Samuel said more sharply than he intended, surprising himself with the vehemence of his reaction. The thought of Emily being passed from family to family, treated as little more than free labor, filled him with an anger he didn't fully understand. That's not what I meant. Emily looked up at him with confusion, and Samuel realized he was at a crossroads he'd never expected to face. Every rational part of his mind told him to take her to town, to find some nice family who could give her the proper upbringing she deserved. But looking at her face, seeing the trust and hope warring with fear in her eyes, he found himself saying words he'd never planned to speak. What I meant was, Samuel continued, his voice gentler now, you can't stay here indefinitely without us making it official. Legal-like. Emily's eyes widened with something that might have been hope. What do you mean? Samuel took a deep breath, knowing that once he spoke the words, there would be no taking them back. I mean, I could adopt you if you're willing. Make you my daughter proper, give you my name and my protection. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Emily stared at him with those eyes that reminded him so much of Martha, and Samuel found himself holding his breath, waiting for her response. He'd surprised himself with the offer, but now that the words were spoken, he realized they felt right in a way nothing had felt right for years. You'd want me? Emily whispered, her voice so small he had to strain to hear it. Even though I'm not really your kin, Samuel felt his throat tighten with emotion. Emily Rose Patterson, he said formally. Family isn't just about blood. It's about choosing to care for someone, to protect them, to love them no matter what. If you'll have me as your pa, I'd be honored to have you as my daughter. Emily's face crumpled, and for a moment Samuel feared he'd said the wrong thing. But then she was across the room and in his arms, her thin body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. Samuel held her carefully, this precious burden that had been delivered to his door by the storm, and felt something in his own chest break open like a dam bursting. I promise I'll be good, Emily sobbed against his shirt. I'll work hard and I won't be any trouble and I'll Hush now, Samuel said, his own voice thick with unshed tears. You don't have to earn your place here, child. You already have it. They held each other as the morning sun climbed higher, casting warm light through the windows of the house that no longer felt empty. Samuel thought about all the changes that would come, all the adjustments they'd both have to make. He'd have to learn to be a father, to think of someone other than himself, to make decisions based on what was best for Emily rather than what was easiest for him. There would be legal papers to file, trips to town to buy proper clothes and school supplies, arrangements to be made for Emily's education. The house would need to be child-proofed, the spare room converted into a proper bedroom for a young girl. He'd have to learn about braiding hair and mending dresses, about nightmares and childhood fears, about all the thousand small things that came with raising a child. But more than that, he'd have to learn to open his heart again, to care about someone so deeply that their pain became his pain, their joy his joy. It was a terrifying prospect for a man who'd spent 8 years building walls around his emotions, but looking at Emily's tear-stained face, he knew he was ready to try. What's in the bundle? Samuel asked gently, nodding toward the package Emily had clutched so protectively since her arrival. Emily wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and carefully unwrapped the oilcloth. Inside were a few precious possessions, a small wooden doll with yarn hair, a tintype photograph of her family, a worn leather Bible, and a folded piece of paper that looked like it had been read many times. Pi wrote me a letter, Emily explained, handling the paper with reverent care. Before the end, he told me about you, about how you were a good man who'd lost his wife and might understand about being alone. Samuel took the letter with trembling hands, recognizing Jacob Patterson's careful script despite the weakness that illness had brought to his handwriting. The words were simple but profound, a dying father's plea for his daughter's future and his faith in Samuel's character. He was right, Samuel said finally, folding the letter carefully and handing it back to Emily. I do understand about being alone, but I also understand that sometimes God sends us exactly what we need, even when we don't know we need it. Emily smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her, and Samuel felt his heart skip a beat at the transformation it brought to her face. She looked like Martha when she smiled, but she also looked like herself, like the young woman she would someday become under his care and protection. The days that followed were filled with activity and adjustment. Samuel made the trip to Cedar Ridge to file the adoption papers, enduring the curious stares and whispered questions of townsfolk who couldn't quite believe that the hermit rancher had suddenly acquired a daughter. Emily charmed everyone she met with her quiet dignity and quick smile, and soon the gossip turned from skepticism to approval. Samuel found himself seeing his ranch through Emily's eyes, noticing things he'd long taken for granted. She marveled at the vastness of the land, the beauty of the sunsets, the gentle nature of his cattle. She threw herself into ranch life with enthusiasm, learning to milk cows, gather eggs, and tend the vegetable garden with an eagerness that both impressed and worried Samuel. "You don't have to work so hard," he told her one evening as she helped him mend fences, her small hands surprisingly deft with the wire. "You're a child, not a hired hand." Emily looked up at him with serious eyes. "I want to help," she said simply. "This is my home now, and I want to take care of it like you do." Home. The word hit Samuel like a physical blow, and he realized that's exactly what the ranch had become again. Not just his refuge from the world, but a real home where laughter echoed in the rooms and the smell of Emily's baking filled the kitchen. She had a natural talent for cooking, often improving on his simple meals with creative additions and careful attention to flavor. Evenings became something Samuel looked forward to rather than endured. Emily would sit by the fire after dinner, working on her letters or reading from one of the books Samuel ordered from town, her voice filling the silence that had oppressed him for so many years. Sometimes she would ask him to tell her stories about the old days, about Martha, about the early years of the ranch, and Samuel found himself sharing memories he'd kept locked away for years. "What was she like?" Emily asked one night, looking at the daguerreotype of Martha that Samuel had brought down from his bedroom. "Your wife, I mean." Samuel studied the image, seeing Martha's gentle face frozen in time, forever young, forever beautiful. "She was like you in some ways," he said finally, "strong but gentle, brave but kind. She would have loved you something fierce." Emily traced the edge of the photograph with one finger. "I wish I could have met her. She would have been proud to call you daughter," Samuel said, and meant it. He could almost imagine Martha's reaction to Emily, the joy she would have felt at finally having a child to nurture and love. In some ways, adopting Emily felt like honoring Martha's memory, fulfilling the dreams they'd shared but never realized. As autumn deepened into winter, Samuel arranged for Emily to attend school in Cedar Ridge, riding into town with her each Monday morning and collecting her each Friday afternoon. It was a sacrifice for both of them, the separation difficult after growing so close. But Samuel knew education was crucial for Emily's future. Emily threw herself into her studies with the same determination she brought to everything else, quickly catching up to and then surpassing children her own age. Her teachers praised her intelligence and work ethic, and Samuel felt a pride he'd never experienced before as he watched her grow and flourish. But it was the small moments that truly transformed Samuel's life. Emily singing while she worked in the garden, her voice clear and sweet in the morning air. The way she would slip her small hand into his when they walked to the barn in the evenings. Her excited chatter about her day at school, sharing every detail as if it were the most important news in the world. One evening in late November, as the first snow of winter dusted the plains, Emily approached Samuel with a serious expression that made him put down his book and give her his full attention. "Hey," she said, and the word still made Samuel's heart skip a beat every time she used it. "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" "Sweetheart." Emily settled into the chair across from him, her hands folded in her lap in the gesture he'd come to recognize as her preparation for serious conversation. "I want to change my name," she said quietly. Samuel felt a flicker of concern. "Change it how?" "I want to be Emily Rose Hartwell," she said, meeting his eyes directly. "I mean, I know Patterson was my birth pie's name, and I'll always remember him and love him. But you're my pa now, and I want to have your name proper like." Samuel felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Emily, you don't have to." "I want to," she interrupted, her voice firm with conviction. "The Pattersons will always be part of me, but the Hartwells are my future." "Our future." Samuel nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he finally found his voice, it was rough with unshed tears. "Then Emily Rose Hartwell it is," he said. "And I couldn't be prouder to share my name with you." Emily smiled that radiant smile that transformed her entire face. And Samuel realized that somewhere in the months since she'd appeared at his door, he'd stopped just surviving and started truly living again. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for 8 years had been replaced by purpose, by love, by the daily miracle of watching a young girl grow into the remarkable woman she was destined to become. Winter passed in a blur of cozy evenings, snowball fights, and the quiet satisfaction of work shared between father and daughter. Samuel taught Emily to ride, and she took to it with natural grace, soon able to help him with the cattle and the endless tasks of ranch life. In return, she taught him things he'd forgotten: how to laugh, how to hope, how to see wonder in the simple beauty of a sunrise or the first green shoots of spring grass. Spring brought new challenges and new joys. Emily's 13th birthday was celebrated with a cake she baked herself and presents Samuel had ordered from the Montgomery Ward catalog. She was growing taller, becoming less child and more young woman with each passing day, and Samuel felt the bittersweet knowledge that the years would pass too quickly, that someday she would want a life beyond the boundaries of the Double H Ranch. But for now, she was content to be his daughter, to learn from him and teach him in return, to build the family neither of them had expected to find. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and they sat together on the porch watching the stars emerge, Samuel would think about the night Emily had appeared at his door, a small figure in the storm carrying fate in her wake. He'd been a lonely man then, closed off from the world and from hope, existing rather than living. Emily had changed all that, not through any grand gesture or dramatic transformation, but through the simple act of needing him, trusting him, choosing to love him despite having every reason to be wary of the world and the people in it. Looking at Emily now, her face animated as she told him about her plans for expanding the vegetable garden, Samuel realized that fate had indeed come to his door that stormy night. Not the kind of fate that destroys and takes away, but the kind that builds and gives back, that takes two broken pieces and makes them whole. The Double H Ranch was no longer a monument to what might have been. It had become what it was always meant to be: a home filled with love, laughter, and the endless possibilities that came with family. Samuel Hartwell was no longer a lonely rancher waiting for his life to end. He was a father, a guardian, a man who had learned that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as burdens, and that love, once thought lost forever, could bloom again in the most unexpected places. As the years stretched ahead of them, full of promise and potential, Samuel knew that whatever challenges they might face, they would face them together. Emily Rose Hartwell, the orphan girl who had knocked on his door in the storm, had brought him the one thing he thought he'd lost forever: a reason to believe in tomorrow.